This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
This is Paul Verschure, here together with Tony Prescott. This is the last podcast of the 10th edition of BCBT. And essentially it's up to Tony and me now to discuss our talks. But also I think to reflect a little bit on what we tried to achieve this, all the preceding BCBTs and the current BCBT. Because in some sense we also started this whole thing, the summer school and the Living Machine conference that's now running for 6 years, with the idea to really build or carve out, if you want, a multidisciplinary domain that combines the study of mind and brain with the appropriate technologies to really build, if you want, artificial mind and brain as a model. And this is definitely reminiscent of, let's say, the cybernetics revolution of the 40s and 50s, right? And I'm definitely greatly inspired by that period. And also, Tony, you started your talk with this famous Rosenbluth and Wiener quote, like the best model of a cat is the cat, and preferably the same cat. But so, and you use it more often in your talk, so you find it apparently an important point of departure. So why do you find that a useful observation?
Well, I think it's interesting because so many people misunderstand that quote because it's it's meant ironically, and people use it as if it. Occasionally, people use it as if they think it's you're meant to take that literally, and always study the cat if you want to understand the cat. Whereas what Rosenbluth and Wiener were saying is, look, you can't understand the cat in its full detail because you will end up with a description that's as complicated as a cat. Indeed, you won't ever get there because it's very difficult to measure. And the whole point of what they were saying is that actually, if we want to understand any animal, such as a cat or a human, then we have to use models. And in biology, everyone accepts this. But what they use is one animal as a model of another. Mm-hmm. So, typically in neuroscience now, we use mice as a model of the human. And that involves a whole lot of assumptions which we don't often discuss, or they're not often pushed to the fore, perhaps the way they should be. But even more than that, we use a mouse that might be anesthetized, or it might be that we are holding it down, pinning it down in some sort of head restraint and making it do some behavior. And in each of these situations, we are stepping further and further away from the thing we want to understand, which might be the freely moving, freely behaving animal or person. So I like that Norbert Wiener quote, because the rest of that article, it's a lovely short article, which sets out the value of physical models. And of course, they were writing in the 1950s, 1940s, at the time when they didn't really have computer models, but they could build physical devices to try and understand stuff. And that's what he was advocating. He was saying, let's build some simplified physical models in order to understand these complex biological systems.
Right.
And of course, now we can build these very sophisticated physical models, which we call robots.
Right. So what is interesting about this is, also in your answer, in some sense now we can look at different kinds of models, right? Because using one animal species to try to understand another animal species, for that you might use the word model, but it's in a rather different meaning than if you talk about constructing an artifact that is a model, right? So I think we should also keep that apart, because in terms of accessibility, you say, okay, basically saying, look, I have more experimental control over this animal model in order to make inferences about, let's say, the human brain. But if you talk about an artifact, you really have to put that together from the bottom up. So it's the level of control is of course an order of magnitude larger than what you would have with an animal model.
Yeah, I mean, so with the physical model, let's say it's a robot, you have access to absolutely everything that you're interested in because you've built it. You also pretty much know how it works, although you can never be quite sure until you've built it what it's going to do. And that's the great thing about it. And of course, the reason that people are sometimes skeptical about us using robots as models is, of course, all the biological substrates of the animal aren't present in the robots. We're trying to approximate them with, silicon and plastic and metal, and that's a hard job to do. And so whether people accept that this is a good strategy depends a little bit on whether they agree with the sort of position. I think that you and I share that these physical artifacts are, in some interesting sense, devices that can obey the same principles as humans and animals in the way they operate.
Right. But there are two things here, right? That on the one hand, you automatically then fall into this question, like, okay, what then makes a good model? And so we have discussed abstraction. Abstraction is required, but then there already we see an issue that models are being given the computational technologies we have. We can start adding a lot of detail. So we are slipping away from this original Rosenblatt and Wiener idea of abstraction and construction, because now we say, no, we can throw in as much detail as we want and end up with something like Blue Brain that is as complicated as the original neural system we measured from and as incomprehensible, right? So this issue of abstraction, I think, is an important one to really protect when we speak about models. You have to be clear about your abstractions. And then the second thing, and that I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, is that robots give us access to behavior, and behavior is a further constraint we can impose on models. Like with animal models, what you see happening is that to keep things controllable, because that's the key constraint of any experiment, you push animals into a corner of their behavioral space where you might never find them in the real world. This is something Leah was pointing to, right, with her animals that live now in these pens in the real world. So you might have, if you constrained or distorted their behavioral output so much that actually you don't really understand what these animals are doing. And I think behavior is one of the key constraints we have, and we lost it largely for many decades. Also in the reaction against, if you want, behaviorism, which is strong adherence to behavior. But the robot allows us again to bring in behavior as a constraint on these abstract constructs that we call models.
Yeah, I think, and this is sort of ethological realism that you can begin to bring back with robot models is going to really help. But I think there's also a little bit of a problem in this field that you also need to work with these models. You have to have an understanding of how to do controlled experiments still. And so we find a lot of people chucking together physical devices that resemble some animal, and it does some behavior that resembles the animal behavior, but it's not necessarily helping us to answer any question. So the methodology for how we go about this, what Breitenberg, who is another great, inspiration for me, and I think for us both, what he called synthetic psychology. It's good to try and thrash out what is the best methodology or what are appropriate methodologies for doing synthetic psychology well.
Right.
And I think that's a bit what we've been trying to grapple with at BCBT and Living Machines, is to look across the range of approaches people are taking and ask questions like, how do biologists and engineers need to work together in order to progress this field? What is an appropriate way to design an experiment that involves a robot as opposed to an animal? How do you... And I think that your talk today was a nice example of when you were talking about vicarious trial and error and linking the literature from Tolman through to early studies on how rats, look both ways in a maze before deciding which way to turn. Recent data from David Reddish showing that there's really activity in the hippocampus that shows the rat's really thinking about turning left before it goes right. And then showing in a robot model that has embedded within it a model of that neural system that we can capture those properties. And I think within the 10 years we've been doing BCBT, I think our understanding of that methodology has progressed, actually. And it's not straightforward to see how to do this when you first get going with it.
Right. No, absolutely. So I think this, so what I see that methodologically, what helped me a lot is that we always have been advancing our models along two lines or two levels of abstraction. So one, the distributed adaptive control theory, which is very strongly anchored in behavior and robotics, which helps me to think about behavior and underlying, if you want, psychological processes of memory, attention, decision-making, action selection, and so on, without immediately constraining myself by substrate. Like, how can neurons do this? What I always did try to do at that level is to say, well, let's at least not violate the obvious. Let's not violate things we know, such as neurons do not broadcast global information to each other, for instance, right? So you try to impose these kinds of constraints. You try to keep any kind of rules of learning based on local information and so on. But then, so that helped us to really build these integrative behavioral models, which means you have to really think about real-time, real-world, embodied control. And then in parallel, we would run these more detailed models where we say, okay, here we make a prediction about, let's say, conjunctive representations playing a role in optimal decision-making, right? That one of the early predictions we had was that sensory motor states are like the primitive representation elements for optimal decision-making in a Bayesian sense. And that then became a driving hypothesis to look at the brain. And with that, we went to the hippocampus and using very detailed and also anatomically and physiologically sophisticated models, working with Cesar Reyna-Costa and John Listman, we really could interpret a lot of properties of this hippocampal system that looked initially very puzzling. But in that case, we didn't worry too much yet about behavioral consequence. But once we nailed that model and we had the basic principles in place, then we could bring it together again in a robot model, because now I could replace a bunch of the, let's say, memory systems that I had defined more algorithmically with a much more constrained model of hippocampal processing that then suddenly gave me new features that I had never thought of before. Because initially in DEC, I was always thinking about short-term memory in terms of a sequential representation of sensory motor states that I could then link to goals for policy generation. But then by mapping that back to the hippocampus, we learned that actually hippocampus is doing mind travel, right? It's exploiting these sequences in vicarious trial and error to actually make predictions and have an internal simulation of what the world might look like when you go in one direction as opposed to the other. And that's now a whole new feature that we unlocked in the context of this overall framework of DEC and optimal control or robust control in the context of behavior. So there's a real, very constructive synergy now between these lines of modeling that I think it took, of course, some time to build that momentum. But I think now we're really gathering the fruits of that.
And if we say that the core problem, and I don't think there's one problem, there's many problems we're interested in, but one core problem is the question of architecture. What is the control architecture of the brain? And obviously that's the core question behind a lot of your work. Then there's a top-down way of approaching that, which is you look at behavior, you look at what systems in principle could generate that behavior, and you try and build those systems and demonstrate that they're sufficient. And then there's the more bottom-up approach. You look at the circuits that you find in the biological systems that have that behavior, and you see how those circuits could have properties that could instantiate those principles. I mean, so would you agree there's this combination of top-down, bottom-up that you're trying to do sort of in parallel lines, and they're trying to feed in to answer these central questions about the architecture. So there are the different levels of description here, but in a way we want to push for the high-level description, which is going to be then the most powerful set of principles.
Yeah. No, look, absolutely. You're right. And it's really important to also not give any kind of exclusive status to either of the two. You have to do both to identify the constraints. So yeah, I see this really as a combined top-down, bottom-up approach. However, I think it's important to observe that to make that work constructively, you must commit yourself to clear empirical benchmarks. Otherwise, we're in fantasy land, and then we very quickly wave our hands and we speak of biological inspiration and so on. But scientifically, that's not going to help us. So it's really important to anchor both of these, the top-down and the bottom-up view, and the models that come out of it, to very clear empirical benchmarks, which must be grounded in the anatomy, the physiology, and the behavior that we know brains and minds generate.
I mean, when we talk about that, though, I mean, there's kind of, with modeling, there's different goals that you can have, and it's not always prediction that you're going to put first. It's more things like sufficiency. Is the model sufficient to generate the behavior that we're interested in?
Mm-hmm.
And you might also have predictions. But my experience is that people who have built robot models have occasionally come up with some interesting predictions that biologists might not have had. But it doesn't happen as often as maybe it could or should. But actually they have another contribution to make, which they can test the sufficiency of the model. They can say, I instantiate this theory, either it does or doesn't work, or it needs to be improved in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another thing that it does that people overlook is that it also helps the biologists focus on what are the important questions, because biologists, as any natural scientist, tend to be attracted by phenomena that they can observe, and then they think, oh, well, I can study this phenomena, and they don't always pick, and because you can't, the ones that are going to be important in terms of understanding function. Whereas there's an engineering approach which says, well, in order to solve this problem, we probably have to have this kind of mechanism. Can you see that in the brain? So it forces a different kind of question into the biology.
Well, I know you are a nice guy, but the sufficiency argument, I'm not so convinced by that, because it's very weak, right? It's we need testability, and sufficiency means something like, well, I haven't rejected it yet, but I might in the future. And I think what we should not forget is behind any model are assumptions, and assumptions are testable predictions, or that from these assumptions you can derive testable predictions. And I think people are often not paying enough attention to that. They often run away from their predictions because probably they know if they get declared, the model collapses immediately because the assumptions were just too strong. And so that's one thing about sufficient. Behind a sufficient model are testable assumptions that we should look for. Okay.
Well, I mean, I think sufficiency is part of it. Completeness is another. Sort of the more of detail of the system you can capture, the better you're going. And I think that's where your principle of convergent validation comes in. It's a question of completeness. Can I account for the biology at multiple levels?
No, not
so.
Only
I
that.
think if you can take that together with the sufficiency, then you start to really be able to say, well, anything that can fit all these criteria is going to be a good model. And yet, great if you can do prediction too. But I think to some extent, neuroscience, for instance, has been too captured by this hypothesis testing idea. So to get in a top journal, you have to say that you're proposing a new theory of X. You've got this strong hypothesis. You tested it. The data, came out the right way, and you published your paper. And that encourages people not to build on what's gone before so much, but to say that, oh, I've done something new. It encourages an element of cherry picking, which has resulted in, I think, in recent years, people saying, well, we need to go back to the beginning and measure the brain completely without having these a priori theories about how it works. So I don't know if hypothesis testing, the way it's been done in neuroscience, can just be imported into synthetic psychology.
But I really disagree with you now. I mean, sorry. Now you're going too far. Because first, I believe that first, convergence validation, it's more about how do you deal with the intrinsic indeterminacy of a model, right? So models have certain parameters, and you use these parameters to fit the curve in the end, right? It's a curve fitting exercise in some way. And now you can add as many parameters as you have data points. So now you have a problem of overfitting. And to counteract that, you want to add more constraints from different levels of description. So the convergent validation is a way to think about this indeterminacy of models. And we saw examples of that also in BCBT, that people want to explain a certain response curve, and suddenly we have a new magic parameter in a model to do that. And that's nice, great. It's a way to think about that specific phenomenon, but as a model, it's not completely satisfactory. And then if you now map it to neuroscience, I don't feel at all that neuroscience is sort of suffering from an excess of hypothesis. To the contrary, I think it's suffering from an excess of technologies that, people get enslaved or entrained by the technologies they have available. And every technology will unlock another set of potential correlations in the universe, and we're going to chase them all down. So actually, I feel that we're really hypothesis starved and data rich.
Well, I think that what you mean by hypothesis, what I mean by hypothesis, is something a bit different. So what I'm thinking of in terms of a hypothesis is it can be some quite relatively straightforward, say, a way of saying, well, people in the past have said this system is wired up in this way, and here we have data that shows something different.
Ah, like that. Okay.
Yeah. So what we're lacking in neuroscience is truly explanatory theories of systems.
Absolutely.
And yes, explanatory theories should give rise to predictions, but I think they should explain first. So, I mean, my reading of philosophy of science, I've been I was, schooled in the 1980s when Popper was everything. And
I always forget how old you are.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the sort of all the emphasis on Popperian falsification, which is good experimental design, has detracted from the need to have strong explanatory theories. And I read David Deutsch's Fabric of Reality, and he's a physicist, but the first chapter of that book really drives home the difference between science as explanation and science as a predictive tool. And these are two quite different things. Science as a predictive tool is great, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're explaining anything. And to me, the first goal of science is to explain.
Sure. Look, I completely agree with you. So there actually, I did my philosophy of science in German. So you can imagine what the content was like, rather normative. But of course, it included Popper, but not only. But indeed, it's limiting. Popper is definitely limiting, and Deutsch is right. And the criteria for any theory is, in my opinion, threefold. It is to explain and predict and control. Right? These are, for me, the criteria of a theory, and that's why DAC is phrased the way it is, because we try to explain adaptive behavior, different forms. We make testable predictions, and then we control real-world systems, or we control recovery and patients. Right? So this, for me, those are the three criteria. And what has helped me a lot to make sense of these methodological requirements are these ideas of Bas van Fraassen, philosopher of science, who wrote this book, The Scientific Image, who is basically advancing the idea that theories are actually just need to be empirically adequate. So we just have to accept that they're the best possible description we have today of a set of phenomena. But they are contingent, they are evolving, they are dynamic, and at some point they might be rejected. And that helped me a lot to escape from this very stringent normative Popperian framework where you always are so stuck with falsification, because it is definitely limiting and not helping us forward, especially if you're in a domain where you have to cut across many levels of description, in particular mind and brain.
Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely right. And the problem with Popper, and indeed when I was studying this in, I think it was 1980, this was already evident, was that if your theory is wrong, if it's been falsified, there's no way in that framework to say, well, that's a better theory than any other. But in fact, we live every day with theories that are falsified. And as I think you said today, all models are wrong. So we've got to live with these wrong theories, wrong models, and we've got to try and improve them. And I think I think you're right. Explanation, prediction, control are three very good drivers for how we can make better theories.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that we can't just look at the biological sciences as a model for how to do this new kind of synthetic science. I do think that there's a gap in science for these explanatory theories, and that's what we're trying to fill. And maybe we can make predictions off that. And you made some predictions based on DAC, which you described today, in which the other hard part of this is, of course, persuading a biologist then to test your prediction.
Right? So. Yes, sure. But actually, we have succeeded in doing that once in a while, right? Including Edward Moser has been testing some of our predictions, which is great. But also there, you should see these predictions as a form of dialogue with the empirical sciences. So it's not like, oh, now I have this normative statement and you empiricists go test it, right? It's part of the dialogue that you have to try to establish, which is not always easy because the empirical scientists or the biologists are not necessarily trained to be very receptive to that. It's not a problem we have. But the biggest problem I see is that actually I started also with Tolman. And actually what's interesting is that since Tolman, and especially Clark Hull, so we talk early 50s now, there have been no more comprehensive integrative theories in psychology. And in my opinion, whether you like it or not, neuroscience is largely dealing with the mind. All these functional properties of brains, in the end, traditionally were in the area of psychology. So this is what we try to explain, but we threw it away. And now we're very worried about what neuron X does to neuron Y. And of course, since we can measure thousands of them at the same time, now it's sort of huge population we're trying to analyze. And then we might talk about forms of signal transduction and whatever. But we'll have sometimes lost sight of the actual questions we're dealing with, which is what's memory, what's attention. As you also saw yesterday in Francesca's talk on the hippocampal system, and I think she did great. And she also clearly showed that, right? How we have to get back to these larger questions, in this case about cognitive development, for instance. And I think this is where the synthetic psychology can really help to link mechanism to, again, function, or in other words, brain and body to mind.
I would agree, but I would say Piaget was also somebody who was looking for these large-scale theories, and up until certainly the 70s was developing them. And I think you can look at Piaget and you can see almost where psychology has gone right, but also gone wrong, because in taking apart all of Piaget's experimental work, and he was a good experimentalist, but he overinterpreted his results, I think is what we can say. And people have thrown away his whole framework on the basis of that, Whereas, and I think now development psychology is fairly theory free, or they're into different camps, which are quite far apart. And it's difficult to see how we can pull some of these areas of experimental psychology. I know development cognitive neuroscience is kind of a field, but it's not as big as it should be, certainly in the psychology community.
Sure.
And there is this kind of gulf between the neuroscientists, the developmentalists, the cognitive science who are trying to bridge that gap, but not necessarily succeeding.
Well, look, you're right, but in that sense, I think what happened. So Piaget is interesting for me. It's really a transitory figure, because what's interesting about Tolman and Hull, they had this physics metaphor in mind. So they really wanted to build a still logical, positivistic model or theories of the mind, which didn't really work out for them. But they definitely had the right intuitions. They're really on the right track. Piaget already starts to get dissolved in a universe of different experimental manipulations and interpretations and resonances with interpretations. So Piaget, it's very difficult to sort of condense that into one comprehensive theory that covers the whole of psychology.
Well, he has this theory of equilibration, which has adaptation and assimilation as its two sides. And you can really link that. I mean, he didn't talk about dynamical systems as such, but essentially what he was describing was how dynamical systems can self-organize. And he was writing just before the second wave of connectionism, and you can really see how his ideas have been validated to a large degree by what people have been doing with sort of those kinds of learning models. It hasn't yet really fed back into psychology, because I know when I talk to developmentalists, they all sort of get very upset and annoyed when you say, "Oh, Piaget was great," because they think he's ancient history. Right. I mean, he is a historical figure, and his experimental results are now, for the museum. But I think there was a core set of ideas there. That he was really battling cognitivism as well. I mean, he was at a time when cognitivism was very strong. He was one of the figures that was they were trying to push aside.
Sure, he was one of the lone voices, right, of reason.
Yeah.
And so I agree with that. But what I want to say, I'm not disagreeing about the key role that Piaget should be playing in our current thinking about the mind. But as compared to Hull and Tolman, Piaget's outlook was not covering the whole of psychology. He was clearly focusing on adaptation, development, and change. But for instance, if you look at Tolman, for instance, he really wants to go the whole way from genetics, endocrine system, motivation to cognition, moral thinking, and consciousness. Right, the whole enchilada. And Piaget already reduced it a little bit. That's not a criticism of Piaget, but that's it is, for me, it was signifying the direction psychology was taking. It's sort of becoming more fragmented and also reduced in its ambition. And I feel that the synthetic psychology we're now advancing, using that term from Breitenberg, also is a real opportunity to put psychology back on the map of science, to say, no, this is what it's really about if we want to understand the brain. These are the questions we got to worry about.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons maybe why we're harking back to these figures from, the 50s, 60s, and 70s is that it has become much harder in science to be the sort of generalist that these figures were in some way, and to be able to go across the different disciplines of mind and understand them. And so there's a need to build sort of interdisciplinary expertise, which is going to be largely teams. And there needs to be an understanding that should be the strategy. And I think part of the issue at the moment is it's still hard to do that. There's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity and how to support that, but still some of the aspects of the world of science militate against really interdisciplinary work.
Well, I agree. This is a very important point, because I think interdisciplinarity definitely is high risk, right? So, and in the face of scientific disciplines that get more specialized, they get more technology driven, that are also very much influenced by their own local cliques and networks and tribes, if you want. It's very tribal. On top of that, we have incentive systems that are driving people into very ruthless competition. Of course, this leads to that all the forces are stacked against what we need. So the forces are stacked against the multidisciplinarity and also the freedom to try risky hypotheses, right? So certainly in an environment where right now much more value is placed on what's called innovation or immediate impact, as opposed to, let's say, fundamental advances. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that the way through that for us has been that in the synthetic psychology, we actually are building artifacts, and we are also having impact in robotics. We can solve certain problems, or we can contribute to solving problems, not only in the psychology or the application of robots, but also really in the control of robots. That gives us a bit more traction and maybe a bit more, also, if you want, protection from this kind of criticism. And of course, also in our case, that we were successful in mapping the theory of DEC to the most effective neurorehabilitation method for stroke recovery, of course, has helped us a lot, because basically we have changed, if you want, the criteria on which we have to judge theories in neuroscience and psychology, by saying, well, it's not only about convincing your peers, it's about actually having measurable impact in the real world. If you claim to know how the brain works, please go fix a patient somewhere. And if we would just apply this criterion consistently, I think we would reduce a lot of noise in the field and get things recalibrated in a maybe a bit more constructive way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's actually, with hindsight, it's a bit surprising to me that there isn't more emphasis within the field of cognitive science on trying to discover new therapies. I think it's coming back now.
I certainly hope so.
But it didn't feel that way, 10, 20 years ago. And to some extent, I think cognitive science has tried to keep its focus on understanding mind and understanding the unimpaired mind as a first step is a good way to go. It's also seeded some of the potential to do applications and impact to disciplines like AI unnecessarily, I think, because actually a lot of the best ideas in AI come through psychology and cognitive science and then get sort of rediscovered as AI. But then I think the other way around, cognitive science hasn't done itself any favors by disconnecting a little bit from psychiatry and all these other disciplines that are concerned with brain disease and impairments.
Sure. So, but what plays a role there, I think that given the incentive structures we try to survive in, people have become very risk averse. And as we earlier agreed, all models are wrong. But as long as you can resonate with your peers and support each other's models, everybody can feel comforted and supported. But as soon as you map to the real world and you say, okay, here's my model of schizophrenia, and now I'm going to bring it to the clinic, that's high risk. Because then if it doesn't work, it's really very obvious. And I think, so that's not a problem. People are very risk averse. That's why they don't want to make that step. So we have to really rethink the incentive structures in order to open that up.
But in a way, I think what we're also saying is that we don't want this. It's not helpful to have this gap between so-called pure science and on one hand and so-called applied science on the other. That the best basic or pure science also has implications in the real world that people have overlooked sometimes. And I think there's also, again, within sort of academic publishing, there's sort of a preference for these sort of big discoveries in pure science so that you can make your career by just advancing knowledge without having to have innovation and impact. So I'm kind of in favor of having more emphasis on the innovation side as a way of driving thinking within science, provided it's done sensitively.
Right. These are good points, and I agree with you. And some of them can go back to the cyberneticians again, right? Because many of them had actually real world concerns. Like Wiener working on control systems. Also, Ashby was a psychiatrist, right? So they were worrying about real problems. And for them, as far as I understand, reading about them and reading their work, there was no divide between these applied concerns and the principles they took from it. They never complained about it or saw any thresholds or obstacles between that. And now this has been all reconceptualized in a way. Actually also Vannevar Bush, right? Shortly after the Second World War, or Science, the Endless Frontiers, setting up the National Science Foundation in the States, was very much prosperity depends on science. There's a natural linkage between the human condition and science. And that was never really questioned. And now it seems to be, we have to have this divergence, like, we have all these people concerned about the so-called basic questions, and then we have other people who do the sort of application of these, and the two shall never meet. And I think that's a massive mistake. I don't think that needs to be the case. And I also see it in our own work. Let's take again the example of neurorehabilitation. Every intervention is like an experiment. And every patient provides new and valuable information on the basic theories we have. Like we have also ideas about how error might modulate learning in stroke patients. These are hypotheses, and they're being tested every day in the clinic with real patients, and we get the information back in real time, and it's advancing our theories. And I think this tight coupling between basic and applied science, which I then call Vico's loop, after one of my heroes, Giambattista Vico, of the fact and the truth are reversible, we can find these loops, we can find these synergies between application and basic science if you look for it. and it's not happening enough.
I think, and another thing which is happening now, which certainly wasn't as evident a decade ago, is people actually looking at the technologies that are coming out of robotics, AI, cognitive science, and now saying, well, do we want these technologies? So there's much more of a focus on, okay, where is this going to go? Who's going to benefit from this? And there's a growing realization that some of the technologies developed in the past 20 years have increased prosperity, but for the few rather than for the many. And we want to do something to counter against that. So, I mean, I think a lot of our science is publicly funded, but also I think as scientists, we want to feel that the contribution we're going to make is going to have a positive impact. So how do we build that into what we're trying to do here? How do we ensure that our goals and not just our goals, the work that we're doing, we're going to focus it towards positive impacts, beneficial impacts.
Right. Well, that's really, I think, the key question we got to answer collectively. And I think that we have to pick our problems carefully, but maybe also rethink a little bit how have we really structured the scientific enterprise, And I think the main criterion right now for our science is how much you get appreciated by your colleagues. And that's very strange, right? Because these tribes also develop their own biases and expectations that might be completely besides reality. And if you also look at impact, for instance, you can look at many domains, cardiology, cancer, brain disease, education. I don't think that after many decades of following this sort of peer-based validation of a field has led to now a massive progress. I mean, of course, we cannot say there's been zero progress, but it has not been fantastic. Like in the case of neurorehabilitation, we looked at this over the period 1975 till now. We analyzed dozens of meta-analysis of the impact of stroke rehabilitation, and it stayed the same. So your chances of recovery 40 years ago are the same as to were now. Well, that should give us some pause, because in the same period of time, billions of euros have been spent on brain research and associated fields. Zero impact. So what's wrong here? And I think what's wrong here is really the model in which we have been pursuing this science, which was sort of divide and conquer, run after the technologies, go for greater levels of detail, or essentially just measure whatever the tools allow us to measure without even posing questions or even driving hypotheses. And I think by sacrificing psychology and as our anchor point of questions, this has been the consequence. And I think the way back is still long, and we're not doing very well.
So that sounds a bit pessimistic.
No, because we're doing something about it. We're in the clinic. We already treated 800 people, and that's the beginning. There's still about 59 million to go.
But in terms of getting science back on track towards solving some of these problems facing humanity, what are the quick steps that we could make, sort of collectively, or at least we could agitate as a community to do more of?
Okay, yeah, sure. No, look, you're right. And that's also interesting. You see, both with Tolman and Hull, that I talked about earlier, they really had this clear outlook. They also, of course, lived through the Second World War, and they also saw it as their responsibility as psychologists to make recommendations and have impact at that level. Like, how do we advance the human condition? And I really think that should be our concern today. So that also means we have to rethink our science. Like, how are we going to really deal with the human condition? Is the way in which we have organized the scientific enterprise actually really helping us to advance the human condition? Take as an example economy. Economy, in the end, is strongly dependent on human behavior. So how can we advance economy without linking it very, very closely to psychology and psychology to neuroscience, right? So I think that there are bridges we have to build to make progress there, and we also have to, I think, be willing to pose a larger question, because if we want to change the human condition positively, which we better do sooner than later because we're facing some serious challenges. And global warming is only one of them. But let's say income inequality, which is a very much social, psychological phenomenon, I think is a massive stress on our society we have to deal with. But that means we have to understand things like greed and hoarding and tribal behaviors and forces that drive inequality. Do we have anything in our hands today to do that? No. Then you can say, well, look, we have to improve education. But the most recent meta-analysis on the main factors that drive education in terms of its impact, in terms of learning outcomes, are not very conclusive. So also there, we still don't really know what we're doing. And I think it is really urgent that we rethink very carefully how we organize the scientific enterprise, how we link it to the real world, and also how we advance more integrative paradigms to bring these disciplines together. Because I think to understand the human condition in the end means we have to go from almost, let's say, the physics of bodies and brains to the sociology and culture that they can give rise to. And right now, we don't have these integrative paradigms.
I think also, economics is vitally important for, sort of fulfilling basic human needs, but also there are other needs, and there are, sort of epidemics of social diseases, or loneliness is not a disease, but it is at academic proportions in a world that has never had higher population. And if we can,
and higher levels of social networking, I can add to
well,
that.
That's
right?
true. Yeah. So if we can advance theories that can help address that, so I think, and partly this is about what collectively we are trying to optimize. So I think the beginning of this has to be some theory about the human life and what it's for. It's not for anything, I don't think, as materialists we would say, but at the same time, we have this ability to be aware of ourselves and to decide, what we want our life to be for, to set our own goals. So there's one of the goals, I think, of our science is to try and help answer that question, because what personally I wouldn't want to do is to spend my life basing my goals and my daily efforts on things which turn out to be illusory. And I think that is a risk, that there are lots of false prophets out there giving you reasons to live which aren't good ones.
Well, this is the crux of the whole story, right? Because basically what you're saying is that we must go back to the basic question of eudaimonia. What and that was the reason also why the Greeks never built a rocket to fly to colonize Mars, because their main question was, what is the virtuous life? And that really means, like, what's the good life, right? What is virtue? What are the norms we should apply to that? And we have drifted away from those questions a lot. We always have felt like, well, there are forces shaping our society that we don't need to touch from that scientific perspective, but maybe we should, because in our also definitely more and more secular society, where else can we get our norms from, if not from a deep understanding of who we are and what our limitations are? And I think this is an important responsibility now for psychology and neuroscience to pursue, but there are very few people who do that. And if they do it after retirement, because it is just a very risky proposition right now.
Yeah. I think it was not this Pope, but the last one that said that some of these questions are for religion, not for science. But you can sort of see what he's getting at, in that maybe the scientific outlook as it is too narrow. On the other hand, I don't think in principle that we should be excluded from taking a more scientific approach to these questions of how of what we should go for in life. But perhaps we also have to stretch what we're doing as scientists to encompass more of the humanities as an outlook.
Absolutely. So, what I find interesting there is that it's very funny that we live in this sort of bubble of happy beliefs about who we are as humans. For some reason, we have great difficulties with recognizing also the kind of destructive animals we are and definitely can be. And we often see that now in our society as sort of anomalies that we can sort of we don't need to worry about too much. Criminals we can lock up, they're away, and for the rest, everything is fine. But understanding the human condition to me also means especially the destructive forces that humans can mobilize, because only then can we, if you want, defend the future of humanity against those destructive forces. And I think I would see that as an important objective of our research. Also for that reason, this is one of the motivations why we are very much involved in the study of the Holocaust and the commemoration of the Holocaust and Nazi crimes, because I feel this is a source of highly relevant information about the limitations of humanity. And we have, and however ugly and terrible this is, and it really is terrible, we have to understand these boundaries on what humans can accomplish for good and bad, because only then can we find countermeasures to protect ourselves from ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that has stood out for me in this BCBT is actually how many times, sometimes in the talks, sometimes in interviews, and very often over dinner, that the conversations have come around to these bigger, if you like, questions about, what are we going to do about human society and where it's going, how we can take account of the fact that we are, I think, as John Doyle put it, the sort of apes with guns, and that's a very dangerous situation. And as you say, we have to understand our own limitations better. We also are now not just apes with guns, but apes with internets and AIs, and there's all the potential that can have, and robots, of course, to both, improve our condition, but fundamentally change it in a way, because some of these devices we can use to almost transform what we are.
Sure, absolutely.
And we're getting to the point, and I think this is one of the exciting but also frightening things about this area of living machines, where we can interface our brains. We already do, of course. I mean, a screen is a kind of interface, but we are able more and more to connect to these technologies in a very direct and intuitive way, which is very exciting. But that the implications of that, I think, for the human mind, I think we also touched on this, how technology changes the minds of children.
Yes.
And the minds of our children are going to be different from ours when we were growing up. So, and then I think, so what we want to do probably more in the future with our school and our conference is to see how we can bring all these things together. So they do seem to be strands that converge in a way, which I guess that's why we call it convergent science.
Absolutely. No, look, I fully agree. And to also finish up this last point we were discussing, one massive weakness that the human mind has is that we always adjust our set points very quickly, So we see disasters happening around us. It might be mad dictators with nuclear arms, or mad dictators controlling the most powerful nation in the world. It might be hurricanes. It might be global warming. The Anthropocene is upon us. It might be self-driving cars, right? There's a long list of things that not that long ago we saw as real threats, and we were really worried about it. And very quickly we changed our set point. We are like cognitive homeostats, So we very quickly zoom into this new set point that sits at this new average now of disastrous challenges, and it doesn't worry us anymore. So I think this is a weakness of the human mind, that we are often driven to action by homeostatic and also emotional systems that very quickly readjust to these new norms. And I think we have to really develop a metacognition here, a critical self-reflection that tells us, no, we cannot give in to certain outrages of our human norms, and we must insist that we're going to act against them with the best of our science. And there, the program, I think, is also partially spelled out already at the level of the United Nations, where the Sustainable Development Goals have been defined. If you look at them in detail, then I think they're a bit redundant, but there's some obvious things like equal opportunity, food security, right for education, and so on. So that agenda is defined, but what we're completely lacking today is a comprehensive science, technology, and also socioeconomic agenda to bring these things about. And I really feel that the living machines community and the BCBT community that we're trying to grow should start to focus itself more or occupy themselves more with those challenges, because this is our future. This is the future of our children. And of course, we don't want to compromise their future too much. So yes, we have to really rethink to place the school and living machines and also the Convergent Science Network on a plateau where we can really start to be also agents of change, if you want, or positive change, by helping us to build new frameworks, look upon ourselves, and how we can change the reality for the better.
I mean, I think you're right that we need to be very much aware of what we might be losing as we are gaining new things. We also, I think, have to be, and it's the flexibility that you're talking about to sort of adapt to culture is almost what's got us here as a species. And and maybe we are a bit complacent, but we have in the last 100 years done amazing things. I think we've reduced absolute poverty in the world from 80% of the population down to below 20, and it's forecasted to go down to 10%. So there are achievements that we can point to that things are going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So I'm not absolutely pessimistic about the fact that we can't solve these challenges. No, and in the past, we've always sort of relied on technology and science as one of the paths, not the only one, to resolve challenges. And I think that's part of the agenda, is to say that we can push science and technology in the right way, and we can deal with these problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because actually intrinsically I'm not. I'm an optimist. That's why we engage with many challenging questions. But we should be careful not to fool ourselves, right? And claim like, okay, we did all these humans have done all these great things. I think that's also very doubtful. It's also a story we like to tell ourselves, like, in the end we were great. We put a man on the moon. But if you look, for instance, in the domain of health, where we are active, the amazing thing is that indeed life expectancy has improved over the last decades dramatically. So right now, it would be people who are born now will be like over 80, and it used to be in the 60s, right? So for us, it will be in the 70s somewhere. So yes, dramatic improvements. But if you look at the change in healthy life expectancy, it has stagnated in the same period, right? That's very interesting. So we can keep people alive longer, but that means it will be miserable longer. All right, so we should also...
Well, they'd be paying for healthcare for longer. There might be something there.
Yeah. No, but you see, that's very tricky. So when you say, okay, poverty has been reduced, but what does it really mean? So we have built maybe a poor middle class that is living every day under all sorts of stress because they have to pay off their debts of their credit cards and their banks, and we have seen also in the crash that happened in our economies about 10 years ago. Right, so I think we should become more critical about these stories we tell ourselves. Like also this popular story you hear about, humans have become less violent because less people are being killed. But maybe that's exactly the same point as with improved life expectancy. Yeah, we live longer, but we're miserable. So okay, we're not being killed anymore. But maybe now we're made to die slowly because of cardiovascular disease that's induced by stress. But doesn't count anymore as aggression, right?
Yeah.
So I think we should be more subtle in how we interpret these kinds of so-called accomplishments of humanity.
Yeah, I think we maybe reduce one problem and we create another one somewhere else by doing that. And I think that's sort of the way it goes. But to some extent, these problems we're talking about are a product of our own misconception about ourselves. Mm-hmm. So for me, the fundamental goal, or a fundamental goal for our field, is to understand what we are and perhaps correct some of those misconceptions. Sure. So some of those misconceptions, I think you can trace their roots in European philosophy and thought, and to people that have taken the idea of the soul and then translated it into the modern notion of consciousness, and this idea that you are a consciousness which is somehow in your body but not necessarily of it. And that the most recent version of this is the notion that you could somehow take that and upload it into a machine or a robot and have eternal life. And I think this sort of very Western idea of the self is at the root of some of these problems, our own unhappiness, for instance, because I think our happiness is linked to all these other physical things, not just in a sort of the consciousness is floating inside our heads. And then a lot of these other problems that we have in the world are down to this kind of individualism that we have really sort of put on a pedestal in the West.
Exactly.
So
that's a really interesting point, because in the Western cultural tradition, there is this myth of the lone or the individual genius who sort of gives rise to change, right? So we think about, also in art, for instance, you would think about the great composers, Mozart, Beethoven, and so on, who now are sort of dictating their will on all future generations of musicians because there's a fixed score from which that piece is now forever produced. And we seem to apply that model to ourselves also when we have outstanding individuals like the captains of the technology industry. They have suddenly forgotten that they might have gotten in that position more by sheer luck and contingency and not necessarily by individual genius. And so it's really interesting to see that these are the characters that are now suddenly pontifying about how they want to upload their mind or how they want to live forever. But imagine we would have the mind of Nero on a hard disk somewhere. who would care about turning it on, right? It might just be, maybe we should have some norms or some ethical rules that would prevent us from poisoning the cultural and psychological environment of future generations with the complete nonsense that the current self-declared, prophets of the techno-religion seem to have of themselves.
Yeah, I think that is a risk, and we should, sort of one of the things that we should be talking about, actually one of the more near-term risks. But I think the what we can do in a positive way, I think, is to, help people, including those people, understand themselves better because they're suffering from a delusion. And that delusion is probably making them unhappy. And also, wishing for this silicon afterlife or whatever.
And more money, probably.
Yeah, and I think the interest that we have in human subjectivity, which I know you're doing a lot of work on, should allow us, the goal should be to have a new understanding of the human self, or that helps us be more content with what we are, because my own sort of ideas in this, I guess, I look to sort of more to the Eastern religions such as Zen Buddhism, which I think have had this idea for a longer time, but they've never, they got us to a certain point with it. And I think we can take this idea and actually, say why these things that they discovered might be true through our understanding of the brain and mind.
Buddha is a bit, in some sense, also a bit frustrating, right? Because saying, look, unhappiness results from wanting things. So that means I can be content and avoid unhappiness by not wanting things. So now the whole religious exercise is focusing on not wanting things. Okay, it's a method. You can try to do that, but it also means you're denying part of our humanity, which is we intrinsically want things.
Yeah.
So there might be other ways to deal with that might be, let's say, more liberating and creative than saying, oh, let's not want.
Yeah.
Right? In some sense, the Judeo-Christian tradition has something similar, right? We should also not want outside of a very well-defined framework, and then, in some sense, use religious meditation to stay within that want. And if we exceed the framework, then there are all sorts of rituals to get back into it. But maybe we also have to accept the fact that we are wanting things, that we do pursue these wants often in irrational ways. Maybe it's also through that acceptance that we can find a better way to deal with it. Because if you look at the way humans now go off the rails in our society, for instance, through addiction, right, which is a massive problem, especially in the States, I think this tells us something very deeply about our society not being able to deal with people's wants in a sort of a well-managed way. And there you see, for instance, here in Europe, or also in Holland, where I'm coming from, the attitude towards, let's say, drugs of abuse has been very different and less suppressive. And the problems of want in that domain of addiction are there, but it's often more towards alcohol and less towards the kind of opiates that you see creating havoc in the States. Right? So yes, we can then say, oh, let's all become Buddhists. But okay, in the West, it's also very expensive to go to these sort of Buddhist monasteries to meditate and look at the wall and so on. But maybe there are also more scientific, informed methods we can apply here to manage our wants through, let's say, other forms of metacognition.
I mean, I think you're right. And I think, I was a big reader of Hermann Hesse when I was young. Mm-hmm. And his book, The Glass Bead Game, is, I always read that as a metaphor for cognitive science. It was these group of people that studied music and maths and all these esoteric things as a kind of path to enlightenment. And it was one of the things that inspired me to be a cognitive scientist. And I think, Buddhism is a bit like that. There are the monks in their monastery, of which there are very few, and they meditate all day. And then there's everybody else. Not everybody can be a monk, clearly. Mm-hmm. And not everybody can or wants to be a cognitive scientist. So what we can do is, sort of with the insights that we gain, we can hope to reshape mm-hmm. society. And one of the things that stood out for me in this school was the talk that we had on decision making mm-hmm. and agency from Patrick Haggard. Mm-hmm. Patrick was, a little bit hazy about, getting rid of the homunculus. I mean, he wanted to do that, but he didn't want to entirely vanish it. He still wanted something which was influencing our decision process. But I mean, I think for me, perhaps for you, whatever's influencing that decision process, there's not going to be a subject in there. Ultimately, there's going to be other brain processes. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of those processes we are going to label as self processes, mm-hmm. and that's getting close to our theory of self. But I think what Patrick was saying, and I would agree as well, is this is going to change our whole way of thinking. If this scientific view percolates into mm-hmm. society, it's going to change our way of thinking, for example, about how we deal with people that abuse drugs. Mm-hmm. The whole notion that we punish people because they do crimes mm-hmm. may have to go out the window, and we may have to, more globally adopt a more Scandinavian mm-hmm. view of, prisoners' rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. And there might be a path to do that by bringing some of these scientific ideas out to the public.
Sure. No, I completely agree with that. You're right. And what's interesting, also, I showed it in our own models, in this case of foraging, that we have this hidden assumption about that the mind is operating as a single integrated entity. But that's an assumption, right? And that's also what Patrick, in some sense, was alluding to. And also others like Mike Kazanika has been talking about this, that you have these sort of dual process ideas about the mind or as Mike Kazanika indeed also showed it in the split brain patients he worked on from Sperry when he was a student. But our metacognitive system that leads to our ability to declare and experience and have theories about ourselves might actually be rather disconnected from the subconscious processes that drive our behaviors, as for instance, this core behavior system that Björn Merker would talk about, that I mentioned also this morning. These are very primitive systems that drive our wants, right? And they're automatic, they're strongly genetically defined, they're operating really outside of the window of consciousness. We have no idea what they do, but we see ourselves doing things, right? So I think this hidden assumption of this continuity and transparency of operation in the mind is breaking us up here. And if we are able to see more also the internal contradictions that exist in minds, I think it might help us a lot by devising better interventions.
So there is a path to increasing contentment through this, but what does it involve then? If my midbrain is leading me down paths which may be immediately rewarding but ultimately bad for me, what's the strategy?
Well, at least have the metacognition to recognize that. I think very often there is no metacognition about it. If people don't even know that they can be driven by these forces that they don't have direct cognitive access to, then stuff happens to them. Mm-hmm. And they would say like, well, yeah, it happened to me. I did it. Right. But maybe what we have to understand is that through our consciousness, we can will ourselves into the future. We can will ourselves towards being one person or another by biasing our actions against all.
Well, now you're getting a bit mystical, because where's this homunculus that can will come back from?
No, it's a dual process theory, right? So I'm saying that your executive systems combined with metacognitive systems can allow you to build a theory about yourself. And we all have this. And these theories can be more or less elaborate, because they say, well, I like running and cycling, and I'm not much into chess nowadays. Right? So I have a theory about myself. But these theories can be expanded to how I would behave under certain conditions where people might show destructive behavior. Right? And if we just understand that we are able to have an insight in these factors, it's in some sense a very psychoanalytic view on how we operate. But yes, I think this can at least be beneficial.
Yeah.
And so to by acknowledging its dual process or multi-process, and one process might not have direct access to the other, we have to learn to develop theories of ourselves. Right now, we don't train people to do that.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds a little bit like monks learning Zen Buddhism, but we're now training them to think metacognitively.
Exactly, to say, oh, I have wants, and I have wants that might damage others or that might damage myself on the long run. So now I can rescale these wants because I have a theory. In the case of the Buddhist monks, you have to say, I'm going to meditate the hell out of my wants by staring at this wall for a long time. I have to reduce the wants that to disappear. Well, an alternative might be that you say, look, I have to understand myself, why I have these wants, and how I can regulate them without damaging others and myself. I'm not necessarily claiming this is a route to success, but I'm just giving a hypothetical scenario of how a more rational approach could be deployed to this.
Yeah.
But now the one thing I was wondering, maybe one thing that you could do to this, I mean, we discuss often how are we going to coexist with technology, right? Would you see technology as assisting you in developing these kinds of metacognitive theories of your own behavior?
You mean as a scientist or as personally?
Well, both.
Well, yeah, I think we export a lot of our cognition into these devices that we have, and they're hugely powerful. I would personally hope that with the advances in AI we are now making, that machines will take on some of the load of trying to develop theories, and I think we can. Perhaps hasn't been enough focus on sort of automating scientific theory development. I know and there was a machine a few years ago that rediscovered Newton's laws. So it's maybe several hundred years behind where it needs to be to help us now. But I do think that we already gain a lot from having all these tools and machines and also databases that support our science. And I think the role of the scientist is changing as well, because we no longer need to remember everything we've read and have it in our heads. We just can access it. So for somebody like me who's kind of big picture, it's great. I can I don't have to remember the details, but I can go and find them when I need them. So I do think that our cognitive capacity to do science is expanded by these tools, and maybe there is some exciting developments in the future where AIs will be helping us identify new paths to take.
But are you then? Do you see that develop along these kinds of paranoid Bostrom scenarios, like AIs will have a zillion different ways to cheat us out of reality and take over? Or do you think that our coexistence with these AIs will take a different form?
I'm kind of quite optimistic about that. I mean, I think superintelligence will happen. I mean, I think there already is AI superintelligence in lots of domains. Sort of chess playing is one where AIs are much better than us already. Stock trading is another where they do 90% of the stock trades. So there are a few domains of human behavior where we're still ahead of AIs and will be for some time. Scientific discovery, I think, is one that probably be okay for a while. But I do think that in these different areas, AIs are going to advance. The notion superintelligence is, I think you also agree this, is not a good idea, because I think there are multiple kinds of intelligence, and of course they all correlate. So IQ is a good measure across the board, but it doesn't mean that all of the different parts of your intelligence are the same and operate in the same way. And one of the goals, I guess, of what we're trying to do is to work out what those systems and components are, and then build a theory of mind based on those. I think eventually we will be able to build machines that can reason about themselves, which is one of the defining aspects of ourselves. My own view, and I think if you watch a lot of science fiction movies, as I do, the bad AIs and the bad robots are always the ones that don't understand themselves, and they have some mission, perhaps one that's been programmed in by some misguided human. And I think humanity will still be its own biggest risk, even in these coming days of AI, that people will misuse AI. But I'm more optimistic that if we build AIs that can reason about themselves as AIs, they will actually be useful and helpful, and not be motivated to take over and destroy everything else. But I do think it's right that we're thinking and talking about this. So.
Of course. But do you feel that these kinds of alarmist messages going around the internet right now, the social networks, and all these declarations being signed by scientists like, oh, stop AI, we cannot weaponize AI, this will be the most dangerous things we invent, right? So do you think we should be jumping on that train as well and sign all these declarations?
Well, I did sign one or two of them. So I think we do have a responsibility as scientists to think about even sort of these low likelihood but very high risk scenarios. So, sort of a superintelligence which would be very anti-human is, I think, theoretically possible. And we have to think about what are the paths that could lead to that and try and make sure that those can't happen. So I think it's right that we're already thinking about that now. But there are quite a few people who are stoking paranoia, which I don't think is necessarily helping. And there's also a risk that we, throw out the good with the bad, that we decide not to have AIs and robots that are really going to improve the human condition.
Yeah, but don't you think that it's a bit of a propaganda exercise? Because first, we know what goes on in the field, and we know that there's still many obstacles before we reach general AI. So for scientists to sign these declarations, to me, is also testifying to an overstatement of the capabilities of the field. Like it's also a little bit hyping a field that actually doesn't have the capabilities that it claims to have. For instance, take the DARPA robot challenge from 2015, where the benchmark was essentially the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster, and have humanoid robots that can operate in these environments. It was one big disaster. And these robots are still remote controlled. In the meantime, we have these huge propagandistic statements about, AI is going to take over. Well, it's still far removed from that. And then secondly, what worries me is that this is driven very strongly by people with business interests. And if for instance, if I'm making money by selling cars that have autopilots, then indeed, just for my marketing purposes, I would like to give my customers the impression or the illusion that I care about their well-being and I care about ethical standards. So by sort of fanning the flames of, let's be concerned about AI, I'm creating trust with my customer so they buy my cars in which they can kill themselves if their autopilot is facing an unpredictable situation, which also has happened. So there's also a hoax behind it, which we should be very careful with. And don't forget, as you also said yourself, the biggest threat to humans are humans.
Yeah.
And before the AI will take over, we might already have killed ourselves. So I think AI should be much more worried about the real problems we're facing. And I can tell you, if you go to applied domains where we need more science, education, healthcare, and so on, we are still far removed from having effective systems, and I wish that we would put more energy in that direction as opposed to running around like headless chickens who lost their intelligence to be worried about artificial intelligence. Because on top of that, there's this very strange and naive belief that there will be this discrete moment in time where it's all going to happen. And again, we always tune our standards, our baseline to the reality we find ourselves in. So we seem to forget that we are, as you said already, co-evolving with our technology. So it is a very gradual process where we change as the technology changes. So this discrete point of transition, like Skynet woke up and now it's conscious, because that's essentially the scenario they have in mind. It's just Terminator, So these guys don't even have any imagination. It's just not what we see happening around us.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there are people who are using this as a smokescreen. Look over there while I do this, and hopefully you won't notice. I think there's another bunch of people riding this anti-AI bandwagon, and they are, I think, people who are developing this older version or defending this older version of humanism that see actually AI robotics as a threat to their whole conception of the human condition. Because if we were to build a robot that could walk and talk and describe itself as having internal states, then that would really challenge a lot of preconceptions that people have about themselves.
Sure.
So I think people find that threatening, and I think robotics in particular has it's almost taken over from the zombie or the psychopath as the sort of the bad guy in the movie, and there's a reason for that, actually, because a robot's a much better psychopath than a human psychopath. The robots are even more devoid of emotion or compassion potentially. So it fits with our cultural imagination to see these things as dangerous. So it's an easy story for the media to sell. So
of course, I
mean, for all of these reasons, yes, it's in the headlines a lot, perhaps far more than it needs to be. And what would be better, I guess, is if we can have, and I think it's partly the fault of the community not to do more to communicate about the science and the research. I mean, so like you say, sometimes people look behind the curtain and, they see the Wizard of Oz there controlling his DARPA robot. And the DARPA robot falls over, and it becomes evident that maybe things aren't as advanced as they might be. On the other hand, if you look at the previous DARPA road challenge, the initial one, there was, the cars got a couple of miles and then crashed, but then a few years later, they were driving hundreds of miles across the Arizona desert by themselves. So
but wait,
you can make rapid progress. So it's not an exponential by any means, but there are some sort of sharp, lifts which take you up to another level. And perhaps we have just had one. I mean, I think people are extrapolating from the recent advances in machine learning to say that we're up on the exponential. I think we're not. We've jumped up a level, and we're now maybe flatline again for a while.
Right.
And then there might be another sharp jump.
Okay. But don't forget, with the self-driving challenge where the Stanford robot Stanley won, the team that won was the team with the most planners of GPS waypoints for the car to reach. And the only sort of adaptive element that made the difference between Stanley and Carnegie Mellon was that Stanley had a little reinforcement learning system that would accelerate when there were no obstacles on the road.
Right.
But the whole planning was done by humans prior to the start. Yeah. So again, much less impressive than you think it is, right? So we should be very careful how we interpret those results. But look, so you're in this human brain project as well, which, okay, you are an exception, but it's largely a waste of money, in my opinion. And we should do something about that, because we cannot afford, in the face of limited resources, to throw it away like that. But imagine I give you 10 million. Let's give you euros, because the pound has no value anymore. So if I give you 10 million euros for a 10-year project, what would you dedicate that money to? So in one word, right? What's the key concept or question you would pursue with that?
So this is just a normal size project. What about a flagship? I mean, a billion.
Okay, flagship. I give you a billion. No problem.
Okay. I think
I give you free coffee as well.
I think if I had €1 billion, I would be setting out to build human AI systems that can really think about the challenges that the world faces. I think if you look at the IPCC and the way that the International Panel for Climate Change, and the way that groups of scientists have, and people also looking at the economic and social impacts of climate change, these people have come along and they've worked with very sophisticated computer models. And over a period of time, they've refined these models and they've refined their thinking to the point that we can now, with pretty high confidence, say that the result of human activity generating CO2 is going to cause levels of temperature rise, which are going to make life bad for us. And as a result of that, I mean, you mentioned the power to explain, predict, and control. I think that's a really nice example of it, because first of all, they had to build systems that could explain data, and then they had to build systems that could predict what would happen in the future. They're now being able to show that they can predict, from predictions they made 10 years ago, they can point back and say, this is, it's at least as bad as we said it was going to be, possibly worse. And then they've also got a program of control, which they're proposing. It's not fully fledged. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, it looks like the whole world, with one or two notable exceptions, are starting to get behind this. And so that was, I wouldn't say it's a science-driven thing, but it was driven by a community that really cared about the science of the climate and really thought that if we did this in a global way, we could make it a difference. And I think with €1 billion, we could do the same for some of the other big problems that we face. And I think the first one we might want to look at is wealth inequality. So you would want to build these models to try and understand human social behavior, human economy, as we said, bring the psychology and the economics together. And bring forth some proposals about how we can reorganize world markets, sort of maybe rethink the structure of capitalism in a way that won't favor us going to this extreme, because the other alternative is that we're going to end up as a society collapsing in some way, because the extremes of wealth inequality, you can already see it in some cities. Some people living in gated communities with more wealth than they can imagine what to do with, booking trips to the moon and things, and then over the world, people living in extreme poverty. So that ought to be a priority. And I think what the climate change model has showed is that you can really use computers for good to predict, and then with using these computers then to control.
This is so I completely agree with you. But what you also see here is that why did the climate change project actually work? Because it gave the tools to humanity to change its metacognition about its own state.
Yes.
Right? So this is very powerful. And therefore, indeed, I agree with you. The computer models are not necessarily immediately there to interfere with that reality, but they should help us as humans to develop a metacognitive state to understand our condition so that we can change it for the better.
Indeed, that's one of the things I think that I got from Nick Bostrom's book about superintelligence, because he talks about different kinds of superintelligence that you can build. One of them is the oracle. And the oracle you just go along to, and like the oracle of ancient Greece, you can ask any question, gives you the answer. And so essentially the climate change scientists have built an oracle. They say, well, what's the temperature going to be like in 10 years? It gives you an answer, within some bounds. And then he also talks about, well, we could build genies, and genies would be oracles, but they'd also have power to change stuff. And, genies are potentially much more dangerous. So if we build these AI oracles, then we still have the control as humanity to decide what's the best advice you can give us in this situation. The oracle will say, if you did this, then there might be less wealth inequality. And then we can then choose or not choose to do that.
Right.
I think over time, perhaps we probably will do what the AI says, because it'll turn out that its predictions are good.
We will also shape it.
Exactly. And it will be a human-machine system. Yeah. So there will never, I don't think ever in these climate change systems are they just running an algorithm. Right. It's people interpreting data, putting it into the algorithm, tweaking the algorithm, working out, improving it all the time. So it's a human-machine system which understands an important aspect of our world. So we should build more of those.
Sure. Now, actually, in 2005, as one of our art projects, we presented the synthetic oracle. And the whole idea was indeed that you engage with, let's say, an interactive sound and light composition that depends on your actions to create, let's say, a very implicit kind of immersive experience that helps you to meditate on your state. Okay. And actually was very effective. Of course, it didn't tell you anything about climate change, but I think so I think we have a principle here, right? It's all about also changing our metacognition so we can understand our own situation, that we can step in and make a difference, as was done with the Paris Climate Accord. But now we have to scale it up because our problems are much broader than that. So, okay, Tony, look, I will get back to you once I have the billion, but I think we have a good plan for the future. I forgot to sort of try to rip some holes in your theories about the brain, but I'll do that next time.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this conversation.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.